the initial skirmish that happened.
Is this the place that you described just now?
Yes, though they're not. They're out. This is still the first conflict that's outside that fence, and then you'll see when they go in. And one analysis was that the police used so much tear gas and their equipment wasn't good, and it blew back in their faces, and that's why they retreated out of that space. So there's different narratives of why. A girl was injured and there was no ambulance in the beginning on the Serbian side, and so Ahmed carried a girl who got trampled when the first fight, when people ran from the pepper spray, they ran backwards and trampled people, and she got hurt, and so they carried her forward to the police line to try to get her. Thank you, they're chanting here. This is where they think the border's been opened, and now inside that corridor that I'm talking about, right? So they're inside it. Of the other members of the Rosca 11 were all arrested right at this moment. So the people who were and we all ended up being, almost everyone was in some way disabled, and so they couldn't run fast enough when everyone retreated out of that corridor, and so they were caught. So that's why his parents had been close to him, so that's why Ahmed's parents were caught. But his mom was blind, and there was one person in a wheelchair and one person on crutches, and a couple other people with milder disabilities. Well, that's Ahmed right there with his niece. Just some small impressions, but not very good. I'm going to go back to there.
Thank you so much. People said he will send us a link to the video. Very documentary. Actually, we discussed a lot in recent few days because people are really impressed by your work.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And it's very kind of him to allow us to have the link so that we can use it in classroom for further discussion. But now I think the floor is open for discussion. So we have students from Malaysia, students from Vietnam, Indonesia, China, and Taiwan. So, and also France. So I think people will have many comments and questions.
Yeah, welcome. Questions, angry, rebuttals, anything.
Go ahead.
No.
Could we go back to the picture where Ahmed is talking?
Yeah. Right there, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. So, if I got your point, you say we should not interpret this picture as rightists or fascists would do it in terms of invasion.
Right.
We should not as well interpret it in terms of pure, let's say, humanitarian state or whatever.
Yeah.
We should politicize it, right? But there is something very paradoxical. I imagine that he's gesturing, giving a talk, he's speaking in English.
He is.
To people who don't speak English, obviously, because I have doubts that Hungarian policemen do speak English. And he speaks in the name of people who are behind him who don't speak English, or maybe some of them, but it's not their mother tongue for most of them, for almost all of them.
Yeah.
So it's a typical case of, let's say, tribalism, because he's addressing people in the name of other people in a language which they don't have in common.
Right.
And it seems that, okay, if we say that a situation or a space has to be political, people who are the protagonists of it have some sort of a common language. You cannot interact without a common language. So how would you comment on the problem, language, in such a situation? Of course it is, I agree with you, it has a political dimension. But we have this problem with language. Yeah. And in most of the situation you describe, that is where the bordering is at issue. Okay, you said, I talked with lots and lots of people having different nationalities, in which language did you do it? If you did it in English, what kind of English is that? Can English as a hegemonic idiom be some sort of what our French philosopher Gilles Deleuze would call the minor language, that is subaltern? Can it be? So, according to your experience, what would you say on that?
No, it's a host of very important questions that are both political as well as methodological and have profound implications. Begin just with an interesting fact about this problem of translation that happened at the border. The UNHCR was actually present with a group of Arabic translators for sure, and I don't know if they had translators for any of the Afghan languages, but they were actually on the Hungarian side offering these interpreters, and the police would not allow the interpreters to intervene or to participate and mediate in any way. So the question of whether there can be politics without linguistic unity. So, I mean, it's something that in the American context, what comes to mind for that is the struggle of the Wobblies, is probably the labor union, when others were organizing, English-speaking and more privileged labor segments of the American economy. Wobblies insisted that there could be one big union that would be that would take even the most marginalized workers from a variety of marginalized language groups and insist that they could be politicized. They did the work of learning those languages to do that organizing and recruiting from those communities to do so. But there was no common language for them as a whole. There needed to be mediation amongst those blocks of linguistically defined, labor communities. So I wonder if it's only if the language question is serious, and I want to talk about it more, but I wonder if there isn't also the problem of this particular kind of subject also creeping in along with the question of language, namely, if we had a multilingual labor force that didn't have a language in common and they were asking for an 8-hour workday, we wouldn't have any problem recognizing that as political, right? Here we have, you know, I think at this stage the route hadn't as radically diversified as it later did because we're only a few weeks into the route being kind of publicly known, and that it's only then that people from other parts of the world start realizing here's an opportunity to enter Europe. But by and large, it's 80% Syrians, 10% Iraqis, and 10% Afghans, let's say, which is just an impression from talking to people in the week after that. The week after this, I talked to people along the route when it turned through Croatia. So those groups had to have people who would interact amongst each other, but two of the main groups shared Arabic as their language. Afghans, I actually found, had one of the highest levels of English because so many of them had been on the route for so long and English had become an idiom of international travel. I mean, they had been in prisons for years in some cases along that route in Turkey or in Iran, for example. And English had been a lingua franca in some of those jails, even though it's not a language of any of the countries involved. But absolutely for sure, people couldn't understand each other in many cases. And absolutely for sure, people who did have English could assert in the ableist way that you're saying an outsized role in these events, and the knowledge of English in these contexts is often tied to class distinctions, of course, as well. But what was absolutely clear both in people's actions to get themselves to this border crossing, right? That means they had already, at an absolute minimum, crossed from Syria into Turkey, crossed into Greece, crossed into Macedonia, crossed into Serbia, and were now confronting that border. So with their actions and with the slogans that they chanted together at the border and the demand of standing there together, I would still argue that they were laying claim to and asserting that they should be able to travel there. And it may get reduced to such a, you know, that's maybe a very small common ground, and that's one of the challenges of this, recognizing this is politics, but I still find that to be a meaningful common ground in both the protest that's asserted and as well as the actions that had to be taken to be present at that space. I don't know. I'm happy to have further pushback, but that would be the first set of thoughts. And then there's methodological questions as well. And this has been, I mean, I've done research for about 20 years in Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia, where I know the languages well. And it's been a terrifying experience to work on this project and to have to go even to Greece, where I don't know the language, and do research, let alone do research with Urdu, Pashtun, and Arabic speakers. Nadia speaks Arabic, so we were able to speak with many Arabic speakers. But there were many people with whom we could only speak with the one member of their group who knew English better, and what kind of English, you know, it varied dramatically. And so there are profound limits to what this project can do. That's one of the reasons we insisted on collaborating to overcome some of those differences, to bring both European and Middle Eastern areas of expertise and both migration and social movement areas of scholarly background together. I guess all I would assert against a very profound challenge is that I think studying the route as a route and studying this as a struggle for mobility requires moving into areas where you don't have the comfort and expertise you would in other settings, but I hope that the rewards of what we learn will outweigh that, but I think there has to be real caution and modesty about what we can claim given those limits. Yeah.
Questions coming up? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for your talk. Yeah, at some point you talk about when there's forming on the roots, there's a kind of weakness, but you still want to investigate more on that kind of weakness. I would like to know more about how you think about that kind of weakness vis-a-vis that you also mentioned that the European activists maybe flying in or driving in or whatever kind of travel they go to. They went all the way with this group of refugees or migrants to get all together. So and their how do you understand their specific relationship between these two groups of people? Yeah, I think my question will be here at first.
Yeah, thank you. So the we-ness. So I mean, when people have looked at, there's Marina Tazzioli is a person who's written on migrant multiplicities, and she's talking about the ways that the segmenting of migration in a number of different ways is what prevents and divides and essentially, she argues, prevents the emergence of a migrant mob, which she actually tries to affirm as a political category. And she traces back to the Middle English to realize that mob comes from mogul, from it has a common root with mobility, actually, mob as a term. And what happens as the route is closed is that there starts to be tests for what's called vulnerability, which is done along gender lines, which is done a number of different ways. There's tests for country of origin, so you start to just exclude people who aren't from Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan from the route, and they're not even given a chance to have the normal individualized proceeding. They're blocked at first at the Greek border, and then stuck all along the route. But in the period when the full route sort of blossomed, people began to just move in such large numbers collectively and without smugglers. One of the enormous advantages of this, once it got large enough, was people just walked overland in large groups, 50 or 100 people, and they had language-specific Facebook groups that were always updating the directions on where to go. And they would be as specific as, like, you follow the train tracks until you can see the infrastructure of the Serbian border. Look to your left, you'll see a minaret to the left. Go across the fields to that village and cross there. It's a green border and there's no border enforcement. And as soon as that changed, that language group's Facebook would change. But in this period, so that there were definitely, people were definitely drawing on kin and language, networks to make this route. But they came to live together in a lot of common spaces. There were all these informal camps that people called jungles. The term jungle, I thought initially it was a sort of racist term, I assume, but it's actually a self-designation that hobos in the US used for the camps that they would make outside of American cities. So so there's a we-ness that comes from the shared knowledge of the route and the means of traveling and the communication networks of the route. And then there's a shared experience, and so there's these shared experiences of these kinds of marches and engagements with different organizations. But there's also the ways that people in those these are a couple images by a friend and collaborator who succeeded after his 19th attempt to cross undocumented from Serbia across the entirety of Croatia and get into the Schengen zone, now lives in France, in Paris. These are photos he took of a squatted building behind the train station in Belgrade that housed between 400 and 2,000 people. and kitchens were formed, mosques were formed. This is it when it's almost emptied out, just before it ended up being vacated and destroyed. But these are his images from the. Do you mind just hitting the light for a second? Because these images are kind of remarkable, and you can see them a little better there. And so, you know, the impromptu kitchens, impromptu bathing was organized, right? Impromptu shaving. There's a cricket that is cooking. There's a cricket league was formed for playing cricket at the refugee camp there. And so, self-organized refugee camp in that building. Okay, that's all the pictures I think I have. Yeah. We can turn the lights on. Thank you. So I think there's a kind of mobile commons in terms of experience, in terms of knowledge, in terms of institutions that enable this mobility that give some common experience. So I think that's some of the foundation for this we-ness. The relationship with European activists is really varied and really complicated, and I'd have to disambiguate both which people on the move we're talking about and which European activists, because people had profoundly different experiences, and it also really depended on whether people became immobilized or not. So when those borders all in March of 2016, after the EU-Turkey deal to close the Balkan Route officially, the borders all snapped closed in a quick series. Slovenia declared that it was closing its borders. I think Austria did first, then Slovenia, and as soon as Slovenia closed its border, then Croatia had to, because it meant you were going to have anyone that was on your territory was now going to become your problem, right? Before people had been facilitating that, countries had been facilitating the movement to get people across their territory as quickly as possible. Once the border north of them closes, you're going to have those people stuck there, right? So the experience that people had who just passed through when the route was at its fastest was, I talked to people and they can hardly distinguish between radical solidarity initiatives and the UNHCR. Like somebody gave them food when they needed food, or somebody gave them a bottle of water, or helped them onto the train, and that was that, and there was no depth to that relationship sometimes at all. I would say European activists played a key role in reframing the presence of people on the move as a refugee crisis after Aylan Kurdi, especially that toddler, the famous picture of him face down dead on the beach, which is a week before the March of Hope. But once those borders closed, then people started to have much longer term relationships. So in Greece, people have really long-term relationships and a lot of shared housing and political projects together, the same in each of the countries along the way. But there's huge class and privilege differences between, German activists who spread out everywhere along the route and got all kinds of, GoFundMe sort of style funding to be doing that work, and local activists in the Balkans who were much poorer. And so there's a whole range of every kind of relationship. But did you have something specific about the nature of those relationships between European and migrant?
Well, I would just like to know more about it, but following up at your point of the diversity of the activists, and especially when you mentioned that the local based activists, they're much more poor than the German counterparts. I was thinking about, because I guess many people that they can go all the way from Syria, Afghanistan to the Balkan Route. They're actually the better off within those. Otherwise, they're stuck. They could not leave the country. So at this point, so it seems to me that relationship of that class relationship at this specific moment have a kind of inversion or change, or transformation, if I get the situation correctly.
tell me a little bit more about what you mean by the transformation, or
so because because the imagination is quite often the middle class helping the last while of that kind of imagination. But when the Germans or even if there are others from the Western Europe, they coming all the way down there, then this kind of imagination will fit quite well. But when that is if the local activists and that's the poor one, the less well off one, but actually the refugees, for those who can left the countries, they're relatively the better off, at least in comparison with those left in the Middle East. So I was thinking about that kind of inversion of the class.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of there's complexities in every direction in terms of class relations. I mean, and there's all different modes of travel along this route. The wealthiest people to this day pay for good fake papers, and they fly from Istanbul where they want to go. The next class who can't pay for those papers pay for high-speed boats from Greece. They take the dangerous boats and then high-speed boats from Greece to the Italian coast, say, like cigarette boat, and then the next level take clandestine land route through the Balkans now. And the poorest, who are usually Afghans, some Pakistani, and also the composition of the route changed dramatically over time also. But many people from the war in Syria, war in Iraq, have settled in Cairo and send their kids to private school and don't want to be seen as refugees, even though they had to leave. That's something that Nadia studied in her other work. So there's enormous, those poorest Afghans who are now traveling through Bosnia, say, some of them can't even pay for any level of smuggling, and they go in groups of 15 to 20, and they travel by night and sleep by day, and they try to take enough water, food, and cell phone batteries to navigate themselves across Croatia and Slovenia to get to Italy and into the Schengen zone where there isn't enforcement and they can travel on. So there's but I think you were also alluding to the ways that even in some of this self-styled radical solidarity work, there are dimensions that get very close to sort of humanitarian logics as well, and that's true. And often, even if people had more radical ideas for why they were doing it, as I said, for somebody rushing through, the difference between a Solidarity Kitchen's meal and prepackaged UNHCR one didn't necessarily matter much. But I could talk more about the ways that people did try to politicize even practices that might look like humanitarian, but it's another area. Yeah. Thanks.
Other questions?
You were talking about shamelessness, like the people showing no shame during the illegal trip.
Yeah.
Do you think it can be a little bit too harsh to use the word shamelessness? Because given that those immigrants they are facing like deathly circumstances in their home country, they have to flee the country. Shamelessness. Can you interpret a little bit for them?
Of course, yeah. Thanks. I wouldn't want to be misunderstood on that. I think the shamelessness I'm describing is actually connected